I wanted to talk about something a little bit different, what I'm calling environment is medicine, and how exposomics fits into larger trends in science, such as precision medicine. So I'm going to start with a quote from Steve Jobs. So you can't start with the technology and try to figure out where you're going to try to sell it. You've got to start with the customer experience and work backwards to the technology. So just keep that quote in mind. So this is a tangent. I became a grandpa about 6 weeks ago, so this is my grandson. Nikolai Robert Murkison, that's actually him 2 days ago. My daughter texted me that picture. And the first one is when he was born. So I have no conflicts of interest to report, financial or otherwise. And so I'm going to begin at the beginning. So remember what Steve Jobs said. You got to start with what the public experience is. So what is the public experience? He didn't say, give the people what they want. He said, try to understand the experience, then build to fit the needs. So in the United States, this is what scares everybody. Healthcare costs are sky high. So how do we provide high quality care cost or high quality care at a lower cost? And almost everyone is fearful that if you get ill, it could lead to bankruptcy, because health insurance is no longer a guarantee. Even if you pay the premiums, it's a possibility. Another experience is that we do need better treatments for diseases that need them. Cancer definitely fits into this. I would argue that neurodegeneration and Alzheimer's disease is going to be really difficult to create a treatment for, because neurons have died. And I'm not even sure what would happen if we started growing new neurons. Would you have the same memories? Would you have the same personality? It's going to be a big challenge. So precision medicine may not fit for Alzheimer's disease. I actually had heart surgery about 1.5 years ago, and I think myocardial infarction and treatments for that actually work pretty well. I'm not sure we need new treatments for that, because it's actually going much better. And then the third public experience is sustaining good health. Healthy people want to stay healthy. And that's something that I think has been left out. Also, if you have a chronic illness, you don't want it to get worse. And that's something I'm going to talk about, how precision medicine fits into that as well. So that's the experience. What are the perceptions? So the public believes that treatment and prevention take place in a physician's office. It's all about medications and procedures, and in primary care, it's about lifestyle guidance for preventing a disease. That's the public's perception. Public health is just this vague concept that takes place in government offices. And what I mean by this, if we want to make movement towards prevention, we really need to partner with clinicians, because that's who talks to the public. At the population level, it's thousands of physicians talking to millions of people. And that's what's going to move the needle. I'm going to be honest, I don't think policy is going to move the needle much, at least not in the United States. Even policy to ban chemicals in the United States has largely failed to ban any more than 4 chemicals over the last 50 years. And one of them, asbestos, went from being banned to not being banned. So my argument is maybe we should think of other ways. It doesn't mean we can't also work on policy, but we really need to partner with clinicians if we're going to move the needle. So the public believes healthcare providers are both clinical agents and public health agents. We need them as allies if we want exposomics to move forward. And then there's a backdrop of big picture research trends. So research is funded against a backdrop of shifting priorities. The big two are precision medicine, that's the 800-pound gorilla. And then the newer one is something called health span, which I'm going to talk about, which is actually very close to public health. So let's define them and think about how exposomics might fit into both. So this is actually the US National Academy of Science definition of precision medicine. It's research to optimize therapeutics for patients using genetic or molecular profiling to tailor the treatment to the individual's genome. It's about developing drugs primarily, not entirely, but primarily for the day that you get sick. So think about that. It's for the day that you get sick. If you're not sick, is precision medicine serving you? So what's health span? So health span prioritizes extending the number of years lived in good health. So it's similar to longevity, and it's similar to lifestyle medicine. It's really about what can you do now to avoid getting sick. It includes diet, exercise, and socializing, social networking. But it also involves toxicant avoidance, alcohol, tobacco, microplastics, pesticides. And it's a recognition that in the United States and other developed countries, we might have a lifespan of about 80 years, but we spend the last 10 years or so with a disability. And this is something I learned from Sean. So this is a movement to try to shorten those number of years that we live with disabilities and chronic illnesses. So, and this is the precision medicine research template. So map the genome, either in a family-based or case-control design for a disease, and find candidate regions in the genome. Replicate and validate to identify target genes and sites on those genes. Study the functional biology of those targets. Drug the finding. Go through preclinical and clinical trials. Then go through regulatory approval of a treatment. It takes about 20 years for each drug. Exposomics could do this. All we would be doing is replacing the genome with the exposome. So we could map the exposome in a family-based or case-control design on a disease to find candidate regions or candidate exposures, replicate, validate to identify the target exposures, study their functional biology, drug the finding, etc., go through regulatory approval, and create a drug. So that is an option for Exposomics. The goal, if we were to go in that direction, would be to create a drug to treat rather than prevent disease. The current practice of environmental health, which Exposomics is really a subclass of, perhaps ironically, because it's bigger than environmental health, but it's population-oriented and it's public health-oriented. So common questions, this is sort of a general type of question that we ask, are do microplastics cause learning disability in children? Or PFAS, forever chemicals, do they cause obesity, or do pesticides cause Parkinson's disease? The underlying principle is, are the exposures going to increase the probability of getting an illness at some time in the future in a population? So we tend to deal with probabilities rather than, diseases themselves that exist. We're trying to prevent them, which is a good thing, but I'm just pointing that out. Health span is actually pretty similar. Rather than working at the population level, it works at the individual level to try to reduce your exposures and improve your health through lifestyle changes so that you're less likely to get sick in the future. So that's health span. And there's challenges to both approaches. So the challenges to precision medicine are this. Each medication that gets developed costs about $1 billion. And takes 20 years on average to go through that process that I went through. It's very unlikely to reduce healthcare costs, right? If we have more drugs, each one costing $1 billion, and each one adding 20 years of time to develop, do we really think that's going to reduce healthcare costs? Not an economist, but I would argue that that seems very unlikely to me because in economic terms, precision medicine actually needs scarcity in order to recoup those costs. So part of why I think healthcare is getting more expensive is because we're not working to reduce those costs. In fact, a lot of the research we do is probably increasing it. Now, this is not meant to be a global criticism. In some areas, like cancer, precision medicine has done fantastic things, particularly with immune therapy. But I think for the diseases that we're talking about today, I think it's unlikely that medications are going to affect it, at least not in the near future. And as somebody in their 60s, I don't think I have 20 years to wait for that drug to be developed. I want something I can do today. As I said, if I'm 65, I'm actually only 63. So do I have 20 years to wait for that better drug for Parkinson's or Alzheimer's disease if I develop it? And then there's other challenges that public health faces. So public health and health span are very, very parallel findings, are very, very parallel fields. So many, if not most, healthy people actually don't listen to population level messages about prevention of disease. So the young and the healthy feel invincible. And it's easier and it's cheaper to eat unhealthy and be sedentary, particularly in the United States. And if you're successful, nothing actually happens. You didn't develop the disease. That's really challenging for public health. And for many, many reasons, those being among them, clinicians largely ignore public health. The average clinician has a really hard time defining what public health is. The ones in this room, I'm sure, can do it, but the average physician probably cannot. And keep in mind, they only have about 15 minutes in a visit. It's really hard to bring in these messages effectively in 15 minutes and do all the other things you're trying to do in that 15 minutes. Also, health is more difficult to commercialize in disease. Health is abundant, as opposed to precision medicine, which really, in drug development, which uses scarcity. So it's really hard to make money, which has actually slowed down this kind of research. So Western societies, however, are getting less healthy. Over the last 25 to 30 years, chronic illnesses in children and adults are getting more and more common. So perhaps we should try to think of another way of approaching research to address what the public needs, like Steve Jobs said. Think about what they need and then build the technology to what the need is. So, is there a way that would address the public's need to stay healthy, avoid healthcare bills, lead a more active life, live longer and healthier by avoiding disease, target prevention to populations that are receptive to us? Remember, the biggest challenge in public health is that no one listens to us. Well, maybe there's another way. And also, can we create interventions that are abundant, meaning they're not that expensive and not scarce? And in the ideal situation, we'd build partnerships. They would include genetics and environment. So I'm going to propose what I'm calling environment is medicine, which I'm borrowing from food is medicine, which is a similar movement. So it parallels public health research, but focuses on people who have a disease, i.e. people who will listen and come to clinics to engage with clinicians. Also, it builds a natural partnership with clinicians. Because people with a chronic disease, they're a vulnerable population. All of us in public health study vulnerable populations, whether it's women in pregnancy, whether it's young children, whether it's the elderly. People with a chronic disease, we've largely ignored. But they are a vulnerable population. They live in the same world that we do. They get exposed to microplastics. They breathe unclean air. They drink water that's been contaminated by PFAS. All of that happens, and it's affecting their disease. And we don't study that. And maybe we could do low-cost interventions that might actually help prolong their lives and improve their health by just avoiding the kinds of environmental exposures that the young and healthy we counsel about, but they ignore us. As somebody who has a chronic disease, I've started to listen to some of these recommendations. We know the sources of exposure for many of these common environmental exposures, and we could advise on reducing the exposure. The interventions are mostly inexpensive, relative to drug development, certainly inexpensive, so they're abundant and not scarce. And here are some examples. So instead of, do microplastics cause learning disabilities in children, maybe we should ask the question, do microplastics increase antisocial behaviors in adults and children with autism? People with autism have pica, they eat non-food substances. They probably have really high levels of environmental chemicals. It's different from asking, does lead poisoning or microplastics cause autism? That's actually an irrelevant question in this situation because these people have autism. Prevention is no longer an issue. What we can do, though, is maybe make their disease a little less severe by counseling them on diet and environment and exercise and socialization as much as you can, obviously with autism. But those are interventions that I think families of children and adults with autism would be receptive to, and that research is not being done. And it can be done now. We've been studying the genomics of autism for 20 years. We're not that close to a treatment. Let's be honest. And the families are getting angry because it's taking so long to get anything to them that is actionable. This could be actionable in a very short amount of time. And the same thing could be true in Parkinson's disease. I've actually talked to Brad about this many times, that maybe if we could reduce environmental exposures in patients with Parkinson's disease, it might improve their phenotype. I think he's been skeptical to some degree, but I think it's possible. Although he's actually been very much an advocate for the overall concept. I shouldn't have said that. And I tell my trainees, play this like a board game. Because I think there's a lot of good research ideas in here where you just look at the public health literature on environment and a disease, and if you think that there's a relationship between environmental exposure and a disease, turn the question around a little bit and say, well, what happens if I have that disease and I have that environmental exposure? Because once you have the disease, you're still living in this same world with all these environmental toxicants around you. It's happening and it's doing something to your disease, and we don't really know what that is yet because we don't study it. So I would encourage folks to actually think about doing this, partnering with clinicians, which will actually be a lot easier for recruitment. Let me tell you, people with the disease say yes when you try to recruit them. Healthy people say, I'm too busy. And you could actually make a real impact in their life if this works, and that by reducing exposures, it actually improves their health. And it can integrate with genetics as well as health span. Let's say you carry the ApoE4 variant, which is a major risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. Well, what can I do? It's not fate. Not everybody, even people who are homozygous with ApoE4, they don't all get Alzheimer's disease. Something's happening that's modifying that effect of the genotype. Maybe it's simply diet, exercise, and socialization, but also environmental exposures. Maybe, HEPA filters in your house may actually improve or reduce your risk long term. Maybe I should eat organic products. And I recognize, there's a socioeconomic status difference there, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to help people that are at risk that can afford it. I think we should be able to give that advice. I actually think a lot of work that's been done in the plasma proteins, the phosphorylated tau 217, 181, and the amyloid betas, might be a great way to track whether or not it's working. So I know I made a comment that Cecilia should get a 10-year grant, and I think you deserve a 10-year grant because it's going to be tough to answer that. But maybe these plasma proteins can help track whether or not it's working. I think that's kind of a second research question, though. But there may be ways to do this that we can actually see that things are improving by environmental interventions. So what other mitigation strategies can you employ based on your genes and your environment? We have these polygenic risk scores. We understand who's at higher risk, and maybe we can target those people because maybe they're more receptive to the message if we tell them that we know that they're at higher risk. Because right now there isn't any effective treatment. So telling them, well, we're developing this drug that maybe, will cost you probably an arm and a leg because it's going to cost $1 billion to develop and it won't be ready for another 20 years, isn't the best message to give folks. Another example might be, do PFAS chemicals trigger diabetes in somebody who's pre-diabetic? All of us who go to the physician regularly after the age of about 40 or 50 are getting their hemoglobin A1C checked, and we know who's pre-diabetic and who's not. And if you're pre-diabetic, you're going to be more receptive to the idea that you need to do something on average than somebody who's not. So I think public health, our biggest challenge has been we've been trying to preach, prevention to people who won't listen to us. Let's move towards people who will listen to us. And I speak from experience because, as I said, I had heart surgery about 18 months ago, and I pay a lot more attention to what I eat and to my lifestyle than I used to. And I don't think I'm unusual in that sense. So we could even personalize it. So there is a component of precision medicine here. Is there an exercise plan that fits your schedule and where you live? We could use maps to figure out your built environment and where the parks are. I think clinicians could do that. We could use, again, polygenic risk scores, and we could track progress with hemoglobin A1C, just like these plasma proteins for ADRD. But what it really means is that how do I avoid getting sick in the first place? Which is a very different dynamic than precision medicine. Because precision medicine is waiting until you get sick, and then there's a market for your drug, and then we intervene at that point. But I don't want to get sick. And I think most people don't want to get sick. And basically, this is a form of health span. So it combines public health principles with clinical interventions. It brings public health into the physician's office to people who have a disease or at high risk for a future disease. And it can be implemented now, not 20 years in the future. And it won't cost $1 billion to implement. And that's why I bring up implementation science, because I think implementation for these types of low-cost interventions don't need a randomized controlled trial. We are fairly certain that clean air is better for you than polluted air. So why do we need a randomized trial to use HEPA filters, for example? Why not we just look at what the effect is in people with a disease and track their disease long term? So how do these approaches fit with the public needs? So on the top row are the needs. Does it reduce healthcare costs? That was my third slide. Does it prevent illness? And does it find better treatments? And on the subsequent rows are the different fields: precision medicine, public health-based environmental health, traditional public health, and what I'm calling health span and environmentalist medicine. So precision medicine, I don't think it's going to reduce healthcare costs. I don't think there's any reason to think it'll reduce healthcare costs. It will not prevent disease. In fact, the incentives are actually, if you have a sicker population, you're going to make more money. So the incentives are all wrong for prevention. It is good at finding better treatments, and certainly if I had cancer, I would want precision medicine. Immune therapy is a big success, but it's not going to work for every disease. So we should recognize the fact that we're applying something broadly that probably isn't going to work for a lot of the diseases in which we're trying to apply it. And then public health-based environmental health, if people listened to us, it would reduce healthcare costs, it would prevent disease, but only if adopted by healthy people, and it won't find better treatments. Whereas what I'm calling health span, environmental is medicine, I'm going to argue, and granted this is all speculative, it's just my opinion, it would reduce healthcare costs. It's much cheaper than drug development. It would prevent illness, or at least it would prevent illnesses from getting worse. And it is, I think, a better treatment. It is a form of treatment to live a healthy lifestyle when you have a chronic disease. So I think it works on all three levels. So that brings me to the end, which is about implementation science. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, it's relatively new. It is its own science now. And it's really about how to get research findings adopted by providers or communities. So we've known for years, even if you do a randomized trial for a drug, you got to get the message out there that it works. You got to get physicians to do it, or they might do an intervention that might be a procedure, which might require something that they don't currently own in their practice. So there's all kinds of adaptation barriers to getting anything implemented that we've ignored for many, many years. So this is a science about how to overcome those barriers. And Exposomics is going to have a lot of those barriers. And one is just going to be education. I think if you go into a clinic and you talk to the nurses and the physicians and you tell them how important environment is, you're going to get a lot of skepticism. They probably haven't read the papers about air pollution and Alzheimer's disease. They probably don't know what PFAS is. Some of them might, but a lot of them won't. And if you're changing the way they do their work, they're going to resist it. So implementation science is all about how do we get people to change their behaviors to match the science. And it's a lot harder than we think. And it's something I think we really need to focus on. But it can be done. So here's an example. So I think we could actually start studying, everybody knows that if you exercise, eat well, get more sleep, and socialize, you'll be healthier. What we don't know is, why is that so hard to do? Because it's really hard to do in modern societies. I think that should be the focus of our research. So this is an example of studying why we don't sleep well. Last night is because I had probably too many glasses of wine. But on other nights, it's something else. But can we improve a patient's sleep environment using HEPA filters, noise and light sensors, so we know what the sleep environment actually is? We have Apple Watches that can actually measure that. And maybe dietary changes. Maybe they're eating chocolate after 8 o'clock and they don't know that caffeine is in chocolate. There's all kinds of things that patients wouldn't necessarily know that might be stimulating that they're doing too late at night that may actually affect their sleep. And that's something that we could do. And in fact, I would argue that this is something that environmental health should take on. We need to factor in where somebody lives, whether it's the home or the nursing home, whether they have a chronic illness, and what their drugs may be doing. It may be that a slight modification of when they take their drug may actually allow them to sleep more. And we're actually not doing that kind of research. But if we partnered with physicians, I think we could do that. And again, for Alzheimer's disease, maybe we could reduce phosphorylated tau 217 levels over time if we could improve their sleep. So we could actually see an effect. Right now, we're not asking these kinds of questions. We're looking for drug targets. I think we should be studying the things that will make us healthy long term and how environment and the exposome plays a role. Because this is one of my favorite authors, Ursula K. Le Guin. There are no right answers to the wrong questions. I think we're not asking the right questions about health. So in summary, there are high healthcare costs and expensive drugs are the public's reality. Precision medicine actually encourages scarcity rather than abundance. Patients with chronic diseases are vested in prevention. The healthy and young people are not. Environment is medicine. Thinking about the environment around people with chronic diseases actually encourages abundance. It's a relatively low-cost way to intervene. And partnering with physicians through implementation science, I think, is going to have a big impact if we can do that. There may be ways to create commercial incentives for that. And I think HealthSpan actually is starting to happen. I think MAHA and HealthSpan actually have some parallels. And MAHA, I will give them credit for actually getting people to talk about food in America, because nobody was talking about that for a long time until about a year ago. And now it's all people talk about. And that's a good thing, because our food system has been poisoning us. So HealthSpan starts with what the public needs and works backwards to the technology, which is what Steve Jobs recommended. The tools already exist. Environmental exposures, preclinical markers, and genetic risk can all be defined, and they can be integrated for prevention and treatment. And this is my last slide. So all this comes back to where I think we should start to expand our scope of study into the commercial determinants of health. So a lot of corporate practices are designed to addict you to products. Everybody I see out there looking at their cell phone may have a problem with addiction to their cell phone. That's not unintentional. So whether it's food, whether it's tobacco, just name it, the most profitable corporations on the planet use addiction. And that's what's driving a lot of health disparities and a lot of healthcare costs. Tobacco and alcohol perfected that. Ultra-processed food and social media have now taken over that arena, and it's affecting us. It involves marketing, product design, and political lobbying, and throwing money around, quite frankly. That's, I would argue, what we really need to start moving towards, because this is what's happening to us at every level of society. And as I said, the most common strategy is using addiction as a business model. And I think that's why implementation is crucial, because we can start doing implementation now. We don't need randomized trials. And the clinicians need us to understand how to do that implementation. And I think they would be receptive to it, because their patients for the first time are starting to talk to them about things like, what should I be eating? How much should I be exercising? And I think most clinicians, if they're really honest, they don't know the answers. We didn't get a lot of nutrition training in medical school. Most of what I've learned in the last 18 months since I had my heart surgery. And I have absolutely changed my diet. And I think I feel more comfortable giving that advice. I would not have felt comfortable giving that advice even 2 years ago. So it is something that I think the world needs to move more towards. That's the last thing.
That was a good, thought-provoking talk. But I want to point towards that 15 minutes that we have with the patients. How do you intend to make that implementation successful?
No, that's a great question. So I know you're familiar with open evidence, which is, so in medicine changes so radically that there are companies that market online search tools to find information that a clinician can either print out or read very, very quickly to understand a situation. Open evidence uses AI to search the medical literature and finds information and collates it into something actionable whenever appropriate. And it's actually monitored pretty closely, and it's actually being adopted by most healthcare systems worldwide. I'm sure there are hospitals in France that use it. I think we need to get companies like Open Evidence. Another one is UpToDate. UpToDate has been around for like 30 years, but they currently don't use AI to my knowledge. And I think that's why Open Evidence is replacing them. But if we could get them to look at environmental factors, and if we published research like what I described on patients, then it will end up in the literature and Open Evidence will pick it up and start to use it. So I think that's the quickest way to do it. So we have to start doing some of these studies, but we also have to lobby these companies, or at least clinicians, to ask that this information be included in UpToDate and Open Evidence. I believe Epic is now actually moving. Epic is the largest electronic health record company, I think, in the world. And they've started to mimic Open Evidence, and they're starting their own system, which is actually kind of brilliant because they have a monopoly almost on EHR, so they'll probably have a bigger market than Open Evidence in the long run. But those sorts of companies that now exist would be a good way to use AI and actually implement some of what I was talking about. But if we do the research, it's also just going to happen. Open Evidence will pick it up.
Bob, great talk, and very important take-home messages. I actually like your reference to MAHA, because this is what MAHA is all about. Just one thing I'd like to emphasize, though, is you talked about how get to the people who are already clinically impacted. I mean, I'd like to maintain that we're developing the tools now to get to the people who are genetically, say, programmed and environmentally programmed before they start developing the clinical presentations, and then focusing on the types of environmental exposures and environmental factors that can mitigate the actual appearance of the clinical phenotype. You know, the geneticists are working not just to develop drugs, but a big focus now is to try to ascertain genetic predisposition, and it's a complex trait. I mean, autism is a great example of this. There's probably hundreds of different allelic variants that may predispose to autism. But also, you're probably familiar with the poly-exposure score. I don't know if you're aware of that, but that's, and what we're actually at NIEHS determining is the polygenic plus the poly-exposure score actually gives you a better predictor of what your clinical outcome is likely to be. But then, you touch on implementation science. That's a big challenge of how to actually get this out there, both to physicians who never get training in this, but how to get it out there to actually influence the types of lifestyle changes that can utilize, environmental exposures in a positive way. So I think that's one of our big challenges, and it needs to be an area of focus where we actually look at not just drugs treatments, but are there environmental exposures and different lifestyle changes that give you tangible evidence that you're actually moving in a direction to improve your health. So great points.
Hyacinth, you had a question?
Yes, quick question. I think one of the challenges is the issue of unintended consequences. So I'll pick a particular example. Was first you could go to grocery stores and walk down the aisle. So we got exercise doing that. Now you can have the grocery put in your refrigerator. So we don't even get the exercise of actually going to the grocery store and all. So technology always results in unintended consequences. And how do we as exposomic scientists or people looking at the exposome start addressing some of those things that, yes, it looks nice, yes, it's good advancement, but how do we sort of provide the education that says there is an unintended consequence of what we are picking up new. And I'll stop there. I had 2 questions, but I'll stop there.
That is a great question. I hadn't thought of that, so I'm thinking off the top of my head. But I think it just requires that we be vigilant that, because you're right, something's going to happen that we didn't anticipate. It always does. And we have to be ready for that. When we see data that suggests something's not working that we're doing, if we move in this direction with exposomics and environment as medicine, then we need to shift. But it really just requires monitoring. And I think I'm being told I have to stop, so.